We've been hearing about tax changes with this current administration, but a lot of people don't know what the latest scoop is. Join us in today's episode where we analyze and dissect what was proposed and where the current situation stands for corporate tax and this global minimum tax that we've been hearing about in the news. As Biden continues to negotiate for bipartisan support on these tax reforms, we're slowly starting to see progress towards this global minimum, but we'll get into details further. But let's start with the basics and talk about what the initial tax proposal was. Initially, it was proposed that there would be a 12.4% Social Security tax for any wages above $400,000, and that the corporate tax would be bumped up to 28% from 21%. Keep in mind that it used to be 35% under the Obama administration, but it was lowered during the Trump administration that just left the White House. Additionally, there were supposed to be improved generosity when it comes to the child and dependent tax credits. This would mostly benefit families who may not be making as much money, but they tend to have bigger families. That tax credit would help them limit their liability and bring more money back into the family. Additionally, in the last crash, they offered a $15,000 first-time homeowner credit for anybody who's looking to purchase a home, which is really interesting considering the fact that the whole housing market is basically in this huge bubble right now. I'm not going to get into that, but take that as you will. So Janet Yellen, who's the Secretary of Treasury for the U.S., she agreed with the 28% mark back in January, said that basically any families that were making over about $1 million would be taxed more, and all of these funds that they're collecting through corporate tax and raising, personal tax for the 1%, these were going to be used to improve platforms like the IRS, to improve the efficiency, to make it easier for the average taxpayer. And for anybody who's had issues with the IRS, you know how stressful that can get and how important it is that reform be made in that direction. So, good decisions, but we have to see how that's going to pan out. So in February, mid-Feb, we were expecting a $1.9 trillion relief package, something that the Republicans did try to fight heavily just because it's an insane amount of money, and that the administration that's currently in place was also going for other wins like the $15 minimum wage. Normally, there's something called a legislative filibuster, which requires 60 senators to vote, which should allow it to move forward. However, there is a loophole called a budget reconciliation strategy, which only requires 51 votes. Now, the issue with this provision is that it would expire in a few years, meaning any bills or anything that was passed in terms of taxes would not be permanent and would need to be reinstated, either through another legislative filibuster or yet another reconciliation strategy. Now, keeping that in mind, there's a recognized need for bipartisanship from both parties. They both recognize that something does need to be done to find compromise so that we can bring back manufacturing to our domestic land, which should help boost our economy even more and take it from other foreign countries where, companies feel like they may be benefiting. Bringing it back would bring more jobs for our people, improve our economy, and push America further. So later in February, Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer, a Democrat, brought up the idea of penalizing companies that would pay less than $15 an hour. Now, this is in relation to the fact that because there's certain ways that the budget reconciliation strategy works, a minimum wage move to $15 is not possible. Now, a lot of people think that the administration, kind of went back on their word, but it really does come down to a strategy perspective. Because of the way that they're trying to get these 51 votes in instead of 60, they have to find different ways to kind of motivate companies to provide that minimum wage without actually being able to push it within this current realm. So he mentioned a rate of like 5% based off of Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden. He also proposed a 25% wage equivalent tax credit for small businesses. So if you own a small business and you're providing your workers with a minimum $15, you could receive a potential 25% of all wages paid as a tax credit towards your company, which could incentivize businesses to actually pay that $15 to, grow the economy, to help people be more comfortable with their bills, while also ensuring that companies have some type of incentive to actually follow this. Now, let's keep in mind, right, if this tax hike somehow passes, Yellen, the Treasury Secretary we mentioned earlier, she said that these would be put into place slowly. The reason for this is because when you think about it, if a country is to spend a lot of money all at once, we get into something called hyperinflation. Now, the same thing also happens when we print a lot of money. Interesting. So, in a situation like this, Now keep in mind that I mentioned that the Obama administration had set a tax rate of 35% for business owners, whereas the previous administration brought that down to 21%. The goal for the current administration, the Biden administration, they want to bring it somewhere in the middle to about that 28% rate. And the reason for being so adamant for this current tax plan is because of the fact that there were 15 million Americans that were behind on rent, there are 24 million adults and 12 million kids who don't have food to eat, and now there are small businesses that can't survive. Now, we don't want to get into the political aspect of things. We don't want to point fingers. Our main goal is to educate. We don't want to get into any of that messy stuff. But at the end of the day, as Americans, we should be focused on helping our Americans and making sure that nobody is, screwed over because of this pandemic. So it's adamant that some change be taken. And this is something that both parties recognize. So this isn't a political matter whatsoever. This is a humanity matter. Both parties recognize that action does need to be taken. Now, let's go to this topic of the global minimum tax. So the goal of this was to ensure that countries globally, try to hold Amazon, Facebook, Google, major companies like this accountable for their taxes. Now, what happens is a lot of times companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, they'll go to tax haven countries, and this gives them great benefits on taxes. Now, more money saved means that the company has more output, they have more profit. More profit means the company's stock goes up. When the stock goes up, the valuation goes up, and that means that the company as a whole is worth more, can do more, can lend more, and is generally good for a major company. However, when you think about the size of things and when you think about the fact that major companies like that can afford massive lawyers who can go through the tax code, find any type of loopholes, and basically bring it down to the point where Biden even called out Amazon, said they paid 0% in federal income tax. There are these loopholes that can be taken, and while it's good to minimize your taxes, at least from a personal perspective, where, if you have the right intentions and you can use that money in a better place, it can make sense to minimize your tax. Sometimes it doesn't make sense when you have a company making billions and billions of dollars in profit, and there are certain gaps in the way that they're treating people, and there's a huge wealth gap in our country. You kind of reach a point where you start to wonder, how worth it is it to let these companies have, pretty much no federal tax. So it's important to note that things like software, intellectual property, trademarks, pharmaceuticals, and other products are taxed at 13%, which is another loophole that they're trying to close. Biden used Amazon, like I said. They paid nothing in their federal income taxes. So the goal from all this is to improve the efficiency of the IRS, to ensure that they can hire more people, they can collect more taxes, and really enforce these rules so that people who are getting by are not able to do it as easily or at all. And the reason all of this comes down to being so important is because of the fact that there's a $2.5 trillion infrastructure-based plan that was proposed by the Biden administration, but it requires higher corporate taxes to fund it. This is something that both parties understand is really important. It would boost the economy, it would create more jobs, and it would basically increase our GDP by a sizable amount because of how much we'd be able to bring back in terms of manufacturing, in terms of job creation. So there are a ton of possible benefits to creating something like this. Now, it's important to understand both sides, right? We've talked about what the current administration's proposals are, what their reasons are, but the defense against all this from the Republican side is that these tax changes could make it easier for companies to decide to move outside of the U.S. And kind of reestablish their headquarters elsewhere, because in a way it's singling out American companies, or it makes it easier for American companies to be taken over by foreign counterparts, as they feel that this is singling out companies, and this is something called an inversion. But it's a little difficult to do this in the real life situation, because they have a ton of regulations behind the way it's set up. But here's what we've come to. We've discussed what the tax plans were, we've discussed the benefits, we've discussed the defense. We reached the point of this global minimum tax, and there was a summit, the G7 summit, which was comprised of finance ministers from all the world's richest countries, and they've all agreed to the minimum 15% tax, because everybody basically understands that Amazon, Facebook, Google, even Microsoft, they're going to these countries that are, considered tax havens. They're minimizing their tax liability. They're saving a ton of money, but this is holding back countries that are collecting that tax where the members are living. Those benefits are being lost in the transition. This was a step that the German finance minister, Olaf Scholz, forgive me if I spoke that incorrectly, he described it as historic. Apparently, they've been in discussion for years. This is something that they've truly wanted to get done, so the timing just happens to work out. They proposed it. Everything seems to be moving in order. And all of these companies are in agreement that a 15% rate is a proper decision and the proper route to take. But the important thing to note is that this is only going to be levied or used on the world's 100 largest and most profitable companies. So if you run a small business from your mom's basement, this most likely won't affect you. So keeping that in mind, we find ourselves in a situation where our economy is affected by more than our own factors because of how globalized the world has become. Countries are basically working with each other. When we think about our stock market, all of those are globally dependent. Supply chains are globally dependent. We're not at a point where the American economy is only derived from American factors. We are really in this together as a globe, and we need to work together. So that's why this global minimum tax was so important, because we are at the point where it's so important that we coordinate. It's so crucial that we work together as countries to make sure that as a whole, we're benefiting the average Joe, the average American Joe, who works hard, who pays his taxes, who takes care of himself. At a certain point, it does become unfair, even if that's the way the rules are written, but we can always rewrite the rules to make sure that they're written properly. So keeping that in mind, where does that put us? Again, it's likely that this won't affect you or your small business in any way. Realistically, if you're not in the top 100 companies around the world, this isn't going to affect you. But if you do own a small business and the 28% tax rate does go into place, that is something that will affect you because that is a domestic tax rate. But we should see infrastructure growth in our country because all of these taxes should help us with that $2.25 trillion plan. We should see job growth and our economy growing, which ultimately does benefit us in the grand scheme of things. As usual, the average American is not affected by any of this, but if you are making over $400,000, welcome to the channel. Please call me, and keep in mind that it's so important to learn the tax code, because if you really want to make sure that you keep as much of your money in your pocket and you do have the right intentions, the tax code will continue to save you. As always, if I have misspoken, I do humbly apologize. Keep learning, keep loving, keep growing, and keep learning how to save your money, because at the end of the day, you worked hard for it, you deserve it. That being said, have a wonderful night. See you till next time.